Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable daily life of a group you probably don't think about nearly enough. Cave women. While the men were off chasing mammoths, arguing over whose spear was bigger, and trying not to fall into ravines, the cave women were doing literally everything else. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that ease into tonight's journey together. You're a cave woman, and it's dawn. Or at least you think it is. You don't own a sundial, let alone a watch. The only thing confirming that morning has arrived is the cold draft in your armpit and the unmistakable feeling of a toddler's foot lodged against your cheek. You open your eyes to complete darkness. That's normal. The fire went out again, and no one else got up to fix it, especially not your mate, who's curled up beside the smouldering ashes. Like a particularly lazy bear in a fur blanket, he didn't even tan himself. You stretch. Something cracks. Might be your back, might be the floor. Either way, it hurts. You've slept on a bed made of dried grass, fur scraps, and whatever small bones your kids snuck into it last night. There is no pillow. There is only a vaguely soft rock that has done permanent things to your neck. The cave is crowded. Beside you, 2 children, 1 snoring adult, and a 3rd child who's already chewing on a stick he definitely found outside. In the distance, someone else's baby is crying. Loudly. Constantly. Like a prehistoric car alarm with attachment issues. You try to sit up without waking anyone. You fail. One of the kids immediately bolts upright and announces in cave toddler gibberish that they're hungry. You reply with a grunt that roughly translates to, "Go lick a root." They don't. Now comes the morning shuffle. You check that no one's wandered off. You make sure the cave entrance isn't blocked by something large and toothy. You look for your woven wrap. It's under the baby, who is now somehow diagonally asleep and weighing more than he did yesterday. There's no such thing as a slow morning. The second your feet touch the dirt, you're responsible for fire, food, warmth, safety, and locating the child who is now naked and sprinting toward the stream. And while all this is happening, your mate rolls over, scratches something deeply personal, and mumbles something heroic about hunting later. Yes, welcome to morning in the Paleolithic. You're not just awake, you're already late for everything. Fire. Humanity's greatest achievement, and your daily burden. If you're a cave woman, you are the firekeeper, whether you like it or not. Because if that flame dies overnight, guess who's expected to bring it back from the ashes like some prehistoric Prometheus with bedhead? Not your mate. He's still asleep, probably dreaming of mammoths he never catches. No, the responsibility falls to you, the woman with one functioning eye open and a stick already in hand. Relighting a fire sounds impressive in theory. In reality, it's a lot of squatting, grunting, and whispering threats at damp wood. There's no flint, no matches, no lighters, just friction, dried grass, and a level of focus that only comes from knowing your family will riot if breakfast is cold. You crouch by the pit, a modest circle of scorched stones and charred regrets, and start rubbing sticks together like it's a magic trick. Sparks. Rare. Smoke. Constant. Your hands are blistered, your knees ache, and one child keeps asking why it's taking so long as if you haven't already created fire 263 days in a row. Eventually, you get a wisp of smoke. You lean in. You blow gently. Someone sneezes directly behind you, almost ruining the moment. But you hold steady. Finally, a flame. Small. Precious. And immediately endangered by a gust of wind, and your mate shifting his weight like a boulder in a fur cape. Once the fire's going, the real work begins. You stack fuel, arrange stones for cooking, and try not to burn yourself on the same log for the 3rd day in a row. Meanwhile, your children gather around like moths, holding sticks and absolutely plotting chaos. Fire isn't just for warmth. It's for boiling water, cooking food, keeping animals at bay, and making your damp cave feel slightly less like a dungeon. And you maintain it all day, feeding it like a pet with anger issues. If it rains, you cry. If someone kicks dirt into the fire pit, you consider violence. And if the hunters come back empty-handed, guess what? You still need fire, for soup, out of twigs. Because in your world, if fire dies, everything dies. So you guard it like your life depends on it. Because it does. There's no such thing as a relaxing breakfast in the Paleolithic era. There's no menu, no coffee, and definitely no one asking, "How do you want your eggs?" Mostly because there are no eggs. Because the last time someone tried grabbing one, it hatched into something with claws. You're a cavewoman, and the children are already whining about food. You offer them a handful of crushed nuts, and they look at you like you just served disappointment on a rock. One of them asks if there's meat. You don't laugh. There might be meat, if the firewood fairy and the miracle hunt fairy show up together. So you do what you always do, forage. You grab a woven basket made of grass, sling a baby over one hip, and walk out into the wild. You're hunting, but for roots, not prey. Anything vaguely edible is on the menu. Wild onions, dandelion greens, berries that probably won't kill anyone, and the occasional grub if you're feeling bold. The thing about foraging is that nature does not label its snacks. Some berries are nutritious. Some are just poison in a juicy costume. You've learned this the hard way, as has Cousin Thog, who once hallucinated for 14 hours after eating the spicy red ones. Eventually, you find enough to work with. Bitter tubers, mushrooms you think are fine, and a half-rotten fruit that might still be breakfast material if you cut the weird part off. You march back to the cave like a champion of culinary compromise. Preparation is basic. Smash roots with a rock. Throw things in a bowl. Stir with a stick. Your kitchen utensils are also your hunting tools, and your pantry is just a shady spot behind the cave where ants haven't taken over yet. You heat your finds over the fire, add herbs, and hope it smells more edible than it looks. Everyone eats with their fingers, and if someone finds a bug, you say it's protein. And just when you think you're done, someone drops the bark bowl in the dirt and asks for seconds. You sigh. There are no leftovers. Just hunger, and another trip to the grocery store, also known as that thorny patch down by the creek. Welcome to breakfast. Hope you like it gritty. Let's get one thing straight. Prehistoric children were chaos with feet. As a cavewoman, you're not just a mother. You're a full-time bodyguard, field medic, therapist, sanitation department, and snack dispenser. The tribe doesn't have babysitters, daycare, or even basic furniture. You've got dirt, a few furs, and the deeply unsettling sound of silence, which usually means one of your kids is attempting something deeply regrettable. And you're not raising just one or two children. Birth spacing wasn't exactly planned. Babies showed up when they showed up. Some didn't make it, sadly. Those who did were either clinging to your side or sprinting toward the nearest cliff with the boundless energy of someone who's never heard the word consequences. Your youngest is still breastfeeding. Your middle child is trying to put a lizard in her mouth. The oldest has vanished, which means he's probably throwing rocks at bees again. You scan the horizon. No sign of him. Just a faint screaming sound in the distance. Classic. Meanwhile, you're trying to grind a root into mush using a flat rock and your last ounce of patience. One arm is cradling a squirming toddler, and your back is bent into a permanent L shape from years of multitasking while crouched. Toys. Try this stick and that rock. Entertainment. You. You are the entertainment. Every facial expression, every noise you make, it's all subject to mimicry, giggles, or emotional breakdowns. And the moment you actually need to focus, say, on not burning dinner, a child will either walk directly into the fire, poop on the food preparation area, or begin loudly asking questions about death. And discipline? Well, you've got two tools, your voice and your eyebrow. And if neither works, you resort to that ancient parental phrase passed down through generations. Put that down, or I swear to the spirits I'll feed you to the wolves. But you love them. Somehow. They're sticky, loud, and biologically yours. And despite the prehistoric chaos, you know they're watching. learning how to survive in a world that tries to kill you daily. And that's your reward. Tiny humans who survive to ruin breakfast another day. Let's clear up a myth. Caves were not pristine sanctuaries of domestic calm. They were muddy, smoky, vaguely damp holes full of fur, children, and suspicious smells. And as a cavewoman, you were expected to somehow make all of that livable. There was no broom. You cleaned the floor by sweeping with a bundle of twigs tied together with animal sinew and desperation. Did it work? Not really. The dirt just politely rearranged itself. The cave was a place where yesterday's ashes became tomorrow's dust, and anything dropped on the floor was either permanently lost or eaten by something you didn't domesticate on purpose. Laundry. Oh yes, cave women did laundry. And by laundry, we mean hauling crusty, blood-stained hides to a freezing stream, smacking them on rocks, while hoping you didn't get ambushed by a wild boar mid-rinse. There was no soap, just sand, muscle power, and quiet internal screaming. And what about waste? That's a fun one. Prehistoric plumbing was called go somewhere else, far enough away from camp so you didn't smell it, but close enough that the toddlers didn't get eaten on the walk. If someone didn't follow this system, you had a stern chat, with gestures, and maybe a stick. Dishes, also known as lick the bark bowl and pass it on. Hygiene was a community affair, and the standard for clean was mostly no visible bugs. Of course, cleaning wasn't just about tidiness, it was about disease prevention. You didn't have germ theory, but you did have instincts and observational wisdom. If your neighbour's hut started smelling weird and everyone inside started falling over, you probably moved your bedding 30 feet in the opposite direction and burned some herbs just in case. The worst part? No one noticed the work unless you didn't do it. Then suddenly it was all, why is the sleeping area full of animal droppings? Or, the water tastes like squirrel again. No thanks. You'd rather deal with fire duty. Still, you kept scrubbing, sweeping, and swatting flies with the intensity of someone who understood that cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was next to not dying from a parasite. Dinner in the Stone Age wasn't a pleasant decision between pasta or stew. It was a frantic exercise in, what can I cook before it spoils, escapes, or poisons someone? And when you're a cave woman, the answer to that question is often something vaguely edible, if I hit it hard enough. You don't have pots, you don't have pans, you have fire, a flat rock, and the optimistic hope that this time the food won't fall into the coals again. Most of your meals involve roasting, charring, or holding something dangerously close to flame until it stops twitching. Cooking techniques were basic. Place meat on stick, wave near fire, pray it doesn't taste like yesterday's regret. You begin by sorting what little you have. Maybe a bit of meat from the last successful hunt, assuming it hasn't been completely claimed by flies, cousins, or dogs that technically aren't yours but never leave. If there's no meat, you turn to foraged options. Tubers, roots, mushrooms, you're only 70% sure won't kill anyone. Spice? A luxury. Flavour? Optional. Texture? Always somewhere between crunchy and chewy in all the wrong ways. While preparing the food, you're constantly interrupted. One child insists on helping by poking things with a stick. Another is crying because the mushroom looks like a frog. Your mate sits by the fire, thoughtfully sharpening a spear and offering helpful advice like, don't burn it this time. You mash roots with a stone, scrape bark for flavouring, and stuff leaves where leaves probably don't belong. Wrapping meat in large green plants helps it cook evenly, a trick you invented after several meals turned into charcoal sculptures. Occasionally, you'll try boiling something in a pouch made from animal stomach, which makes the whole cave smell like soggy ambition. Presentation is non-existent. Food is served on bark slabs, handed out in pieces, or dropped straight onto outstretched hands. Everyone gathers around the fire like vultures who've been fasting all week. If they eat in silence, you call it a win. If someone gags, you ignore it. If they ask for seconds, you laugh and say, go catch something. Because in your world, cooking isn't a craft. It's survival. And if it's warm and chewable, you're a hero. After a long morning of foraging, child wrangling, and narrowly avoiding injury by fire, you'd think a cavewoman might finally get a moment to herself. You'd be wrong. That's when the real survival skill kicks in. Tribal socializing, a complex dance of cooperation, conversation, and unspoken, but very real judgment. You gather with the other women of the group, not so much for leisure as for mutual sanity preservation. Everyone sits in a loose circle, grinding seeds, sorting edible plants, untangling fur, and pretending not to notice whose child is currently eating mud. These moments are equal parts therapy and strategy session. No one writes anything down, but somehow everyone remembers everything. Socializing is necessary. These are the women who help you deliver babies, bury relatives, and drag you away from wolves when you trip over a log. But let's not kid ourselves. There's also a healthy dose of competition. Someone always has a better fire-starting method. Someone's man allegedly brought back a boar all by himself. And someone else's toddler has already learned not to lick beetles, which suddenly makes you feel like you're raising a walking liability. You trade things, shells for berries, herbs for hide scraps, while subtly eyeballing the quality of other people's handiwork. That woven grass basket, too tight. That hide cloak, a little patchy. You say nothing, but you remember. Next time you'll bring your best basket. The conversation flows from weather to births to food shortages to whose mate snores like a dying bear. You nod, you smile, you grunt in agreement. Occasionally someone tells a funny story about a man who got bitten in the rear by a goat, and everyone laughs because it's always good to remember that, for all their bravado, men are not immune to goat-related consequences. There's a hierarchy here, though no one announces it. The elder women command silent respect. The newest mothers receive a mix of support and side-eye. And you? You float somewhere in the middle, observant, competent, tired. Because while you may not rule the tribe, you do remember who let their fire go out last week. And in this world, that's social currency. In the Stone Age, medicine was less about science and more about improvisation, optimism, and a surprising amount of tree bark. If you were a cave woman, congratulations. You were the tribe's unofficial medic, pharmacist, and grief counsellor, all rolled into one and paid in berries. There was no training, no textbooks. Your medical education came from watching what happened when someone rubbed a strange plant on a wound and either got better or got very quiet forever. The knowledge you carried was handed down orally, through trial, error, and a generous helping of, well, Thog used this leaf once and didn't immediately die. You start your day patching up minor injuries. A scraped knee here, a mysterious rash there. Someone's toe is turning a colour that toes should not be. You reach for your pouch of medicinal herbs, a fragrant collection of crushed leaves, dried mushrooms, and at least one questionable root that makes people see things if you mix it too strong. Bleeding, spider bite, sudden loss of the will to gather nuts. You have a poultice for that. It might smell like despair, but it works. Sometimes. The tribe respects your remedies, mostly because the alternative is doing nothing and hoping the spirits take the afternoon off. Your tools include a sharpened bone, some string made of animal gut, and a rock you've convinced yourself is lucky. Stitches are done with your fingers and stubbornness. Disinfectant? That's just hot water and an angry look. Anesthesia? You have a handful of fermented berries and a long stick to bite. You also handle childbirth, a harrowing process that involves squatting, yelling, and praying the baby doesn't arrive breech during a thunderstorm. If everything goes well, you're praised as a miracle worker. If it doesn't, well, someone always blames the moon. And through it all, you carry yourself with the calm confidence of a woman who's seen worse and probably still has the scar. You're not just surviving, you're healing people with zero equipment and a 50% success rate. In the modern world, you'd be underqualified. But here, in your smoky, muddy, flea-bitten corner of history, you're a legend. Just don't run out of bark. Let's talk about fashion. Or more accurately, a desperate attempt not to freeze to death in style. As a cave woman, Your wardrobe isn't so much curated as it is cobbled together from whatever recently died nearby. There's no closet, no mirror, and definitely no one asking you if your furs are ethically sourced. Your typical outfit is made from animal hide that you or someone very exhausted, skinned, scraped, and dried in the sun while fighting off flies the size of walnuts. Once soft enough not to slice open your armpits, it's sewn together with bone needles and sinew. No zippers, no buttons, just rawhide ties and the occasional safety knot that somehow ends up in the middle of your back where you can't reach it. The end result? You're covered mostly, and warmish. The fur itches, the leather creaks, and there's always a mystery stain that no one wants to identify. But it keeps the wind out and the judgmental glares of elder women to a minimum. That's good enough. Footwear is optional, because making shoes is a pain. If you have them, they're made from scraps of hide tied to your feet with cord that will snap the moment you step in something inconvenient, like mud or a hedgehog. Socks? No such thing. You just get cold toes and a deeper sense of humility. Accessories do exist. Necklaces made of bones, shells, or shiny rocks. Not for style, mind you. These things have meaning. That piece of amber? Found it during a vision quest. That bear tooth? Taken from a very dead bear that someone else killed, but you did most of the screaming. You wear it with pride and mild exaggeration. Hairstyles? Mostly practical. You braid it, wrap it, or chop it off with a sharp rock because your child decided your head was a good handhold. Sometimes you add a feather, just to feel fancy. Occasionally you spot someone with charcoal around their eyes or red ochre on their cheeks and think, wow, she really tried today. So yes, fashion exists in the cavewoman world. It's functional, funky, and 100% biodegradable. And you? You're absolutely rocking the murdered an animal in the dark look. Ah, love in the Paleolithic era. It's not candle-lit dinners or long walks on the beach. It's more like grunting at each other across the fire and hoping no one else claims them first. As a cavewoman, your romantic prospects are limited. The gene pool is shallow, and most of the men are either your cousin or a cousin-adjacent mystery. Courtship starts subtly. He brings you a particularly fat worm. You pretend to be impressed. He tosses pebbles near you during a gathering. You ignore him, but don't move away. The message is clear. I see you. I have stones. Let's talk. Eventually he approaches. Not with words. No one wastes good language on romance. But with a gift. Maybe it's a piece of meat. Maybe a shiny rock. If he's really trying, it's both. You accept it with a nod. You're now unofficially a couple. The entire process takes about 3 minutes, and no one looks anyone in the eye the whole time. Love is practical. He hunts. You gather. He brags about his last boar kill. You point out you've kept 3 children alive on boiled roots and stress alone. Mutual respect is earned in grunts, firewood, and how well you both pretend not to notice each other's flatulence by the hearth. Affection is shown in low-effort gestures, sharing the dry side of the fur blanket, not stepping on your weaving mat, occasionally helping with water hauling without being asked. You once caught him scaring a predator away from your sleeping spot and felt something that might have been butterflies, or maybe it was just undercooked tuber. Jealousy exists, of course. There's always someone trying to flex by carrying a larger stick or doing one-armed lifts with a deer carcass. But if someone flirts too hard, you settle it with side eyes and extremely public sarcasm. If that fails, a discreetly thrown rock often does the trick. There's no poetry, no flowers, and no written love notes, mostly because writing hasn't been invented yet. But there's loyalty, shared warmth, and an unspoken bond forged through mud, mammoths, and mutual exhaustion. It's not glamorous, but it's real. And occasionally, he even lets you have the last bite of something cooked. Now that's romance. You wake up hoping today will be peaceful. Maybe just some light foraging, a few sibling squabbles, and no surprise injuries. But no. Today the wolves are back. Or the bears. Or if you're really lucky, the neighbour clan from across the ridge, the ones who always accidentally set fire to your berry patch and claim they thought it was theirs. As a cave woman, you're not just a homemaker. You're also part-time security detail. You don't get a spear, of course. That's reserved for the men who only remember to use it after something bites someone. No, your weapons are more subtle. A pointed stick, a hefty rock, and the dead-eyed stare of someone who's been interrupted while boiling roots. Wild animals don't care if you're busy. Leopards don't reschedule. Hyenas don't knock. They just show up, teeth bared, usually when your hands are full of something squishy. You hear the snarls, grab the nearest child, and start shouting. Not because shouting helps, but because yelling is the only tool evolution has left you at this point. Sometimes you scare them off. Sometimes they grab a piece of your food stash and vanish into the brush like furry little bandits. And sometimes you just chuck a rock and hope it hits something important. That's called strategy. Then there are the neighbours. They don't attack with claws. They attack with glares, passive aggression, and accidental hunting incursions. Maybe they're eyeing your cave. Maybe they want your water source. Maybe someone in your group mated with someone in theirs and now everything's weird. Whatever the reason, tensions simmer like slightly spoiled mammoth stew. When things get serious, you all gather. Not for diplomacy, but for group yelling. It's a lot of chest thumping, gesturing, and comparing whose animal skins are less moth-eaten. Occasionally someone throws a stick. Occasionally someone bleeds. And then everyone walks away feeling both victorious and vaguely confused. Because the line between wild animal and neighbour is sometimes very thin, and through it all you hold your ground, covered in mud, clutching a baby and a club, thinking, if one more thing tries to steal my dried berries today, I will lose what's left of my sanity. That's survival. That's vigilance. That's Tuesday. In a world where everything wants to kill you, from the weather to wild animals to the suspicious mushroom you thought was safe, it's only natural to start making deals with unseen forces. Welcome to Paleolithic religion, a complex belief system built entirely from hope, fear, and interpretive mud smears. As a cave woman, you're spiritual by necessity. When you don't know why your cousin suddenly fell over and never got back up, or why the sun keeps disappearing every night, you need answers. Lacking telescopes and germ theory, you reach the only logical conclusion. Someone, or something, is pulling the strings. You and the other women gather around the fire, burning herbs that smell like scorched moss and old feet. You chant, hum, or grunt rhythmically, depending on how ambitious you're feeling. No one's entirely sure if the spirits are listening, but the smoke makes your eyes water, and that's close enough to divine presence. Then there are the rituals. Someone's giving birth? Time to smear some red ochre on the floor and whisper at a deer skull. Big hunt coming up? Better dance around the fire naked while pretending not to step on hot embers. One of the children has a fever. Rub some crushed leaves on their forehead and pray to the nearest rock formation that looks vaguely like a bird. These rituals aren't for show. They're serious business. Because in a world without medicine or meteorology, superstition is your closest thing to a user manual. And then there are the rock paintings, the original social media, but with fewer likes and more buffalo. You mix crushed minerals with spit, smear it on your fingers, and start documenting your life. A handprint here, a mammoth there, a group of stick figures running from a bear. It's abstract expressionism, survival edition. Sometimes you wonder who the paintings are for. The spirits, future generations, bored children with extra mud. Doesn't matter. You paint because you must, because every mark is a message. I was here. I fought. I fed my children. I saw things that made me believe. It may not be theology in the formal sense, but in your world of shadows and firelight, it's sacred enough. You don't get used to it, but you do get practiced. In the Paleolithic world, death isn't rare, it's regular. It arrives in all forms: fever, fall, fang, or simply not waking up. And when it comes, it doesn't ask permission or wait for a convenient time. It shows up in the middle of a cold night or mid-foraging trip, or while someone is trying to start a fire with damp moss and misplaced confidence. As a cave woman, you feel it first in your chest, that familiar knot that tightens when a cry turns into silence. The tribe moves slowly, instinctively, gathering around the body not with hysteria, but with the resigned hush of people who've been here before. There is no priest, no funeral home, no memorial slideshow. Just hands, stone tools, and the knowledge passed down from your grandmothers, how to prepare the body, how to honour the life, how to let go without falling apart. You clean them, you wrap them. Sometimes you decorate them. A shell necklace, a red ochre smear on the forehead, a flower if one can be found. Not because it changes anything, but because it matters. It marks the difference between a corpse and a person who was loved. Burial depends on terrain. If you're lucky, soft soil. If not, a rock cairn. In cold months, there's fire. A small one, just enough to crackle and hiss while people speak in low tones or not at all. The children fidget. The elders stare into the flames like they're trying to remember the exact shape of the departed's laugh. Grief doesn't have a schedule. It lingers. It whispers in quiet moments. It steals your appetite and replaces it with memories. That time they brought you a weird fruit, or tripped over a root and blamed the wind. And yet, life pushes forward. You gather roots, you fix cloaks, you scold children, because the mammoths don't care if you're mourning, and neither does the rain. But in the stillness of night, by the flicker of firelight, you whisper their name once more, just to be sure the spirits heard you, and maybe, just maybe, someone else does too. When the sun goes down and the fires crackle to life, something magical happens in the cave. Bellies are full, enough. Children are finally sitting still, mostly, and the night stretches long and dark and full of mystery. This is when it begins, the ancient art of storytelling, born not from luxury, but from necessity. Because if people are too busy listening to a tale, they're not thinking about how cold, hungry, or dangerously mortal they are. As a cave woman, you've earned your seat near the fire, maybe not the centre, that's for the elders who've survived more winters than anyone expected, but close enough to chime in when someone forgets the bit with the snake and the thunderstorm. Your voice joins the hum of generations, stitching together half-truths, actual events, and just enough exaggeration to keep the kids awake. You speak of hunts that nearly went wrong but didn't, of the woman who outran a bear, barefoot and 9 months pregnant, of the great river spirit who turns into a bird to warn the village of floods. Stories are education wrapped in entertainment, survival lessons in disguise. Want children to stop wandering off? Tell them about the cave ghost who steals loud toddlers. Want men to stop wasting arrows? Remind them of the idiot who missed a mammoth and got peed on by an elk. The younger ones listen wide-eyed, their faces flickering in the firelight. This is their school, their history class, their bedtime routine. No books, no paper, just memory and rhythm and your ability to act out a charging boar with one working knee. Sometimes stories become myths. A roaring fire, a strange dream, a shadow on the cave wall. Suddenly someone's a god, or a hero, or the reason the stars move. And before long, those tales are passed down as truth, carved into bone, painted in ochre, whispered from mother to child. Because you don't just survive, you remember. You turn hardship into legend, and names into echoes that outlast teeth, time, and the cold stone walls of your home. Legacy, in the end, isn't made of tools or furs. It's made of stories told in the dark. Ask the average person to picture a cave woman, and they'll probably summon some cartoonish image, unibrowed, club-wielding, wearing a leopard bikini and screaming in grunts. A side character in history, decorative, primitive, not especially bright, maybe dragging a child around while her mate invents the wheel and claims credit for fire. But here's the truth. They've got it exactly backwards. Cave women weren't helpless. They weren't sidekicks. They were the backbone of the tribe. The medics, the foragers, the shelter builders, the child rearers, and the memory keepers. They fought toothaches with bark, hunger with creativity, and winter with nothing but a hide, some hope, and a flint that barely sparked. They didn't write textbooks. They were the textbooks. Everything their children knew came through their hands, their stories, their warnings whispered beside fires. They weren't just surviving. They were organising chaos, quietly, constantly. While some guy tried, and failed, to spear a rabbit for 3 hours, cave women were making dinner out of roots and mushrooms and possibly that bird he stepped over 3 times. And beauty? Don't even start. Forget airbrushing. These were women who wore the sun on their skin, who braided their hair with bones and shells, who tattooed themselves with soot and berries and meaning. Their jewellery wasn't from a store. It was from the riverbed they walked barefoot every day, carrying a child on one hip and firewood on the other. They've been misunderstood because they didn't leave behind monuments or armies, but they left behind everything else. Tools worn soft from constant use, fingerprints in cave paint, burial sites where loved ones were laid to rest with care and ceremony. Their legacy isn't flashy, it's foundational. And here's the kicker. They did it all while bleeding once a month, dodging predators, avoiding spoiled meat, and occasionally giving birth next to a smouldering pile of mammoth dung. There was no applause, no reward, just another day, another fire, another rock to scrub. So the next time someone talks about primitive people, remember who tanned the hide, carried the fire, and told the first bedtime story while sharpening a stick. It wasn't some bearded hero. It was her. Long before the roar of cannons or the flash of muskets, in a world where the hunt was both necessity and spectacle, a curious relationship emerged between a human and a bird with murderous grace. Falconry, the art of training birds of prey to hunt wild game, was more than just a sport in the Middle Ages. It was a ritual of patience, an emblem of status, and a direct link to nature's raw predatory power. The origins of falconry trace back thousands of years, possibly as early as 2000 BCE in Mesopotamia or Mongolia, but by the medieval era, it had firmly taken root in European aristocracy. Imported through contact with the Islamic world, especially during the Crusades, falconry arrived with an air of exotic refinement. European nobles saw it as more than a pastime. It became a mark of distinction. If you had a hawk on your wrist, you weren't just wealthy, you were cultured. This was not something the average peasant could dabble in. Birds were expensive, training was painstaking, and the very concept of owning a falcon meant you had the leisure time to commit to its care. Laws even reflected this divide. In some kingdoms, a serf caught with a falcon could face brutal punishment. The birds themselves were matched to social rank. Emperors flew eagles and gyrfalcons. Knights might manage a saker falcon. Priests were limited to sparrowhawks. Yes, even your bird had a social class. Yet the allure went beyond power and hierarchy. There was a strange intimacy to falconry. Training a falcon required daily interaction, deep trust, and subtle communication. These were not pets, they were apex predators, who, at any moment, could choose freedom. The falconer lived in constant negotiation, walking the line between dominance and partnership. By the 12th century, manuals on falconry were being written in Latin, French, and Arabic. Treatises discussed diet, temperament, and the philosophical art of the hunt. It wasn't just about killing a rabbit. It was about aesthetics, precision, and the thrill of watching nature weaponized and leashed. Barely. Falconry was, in short, the ultimate medieval flex. It told the world that you didn't just command people, you commanded the skies. Not all birds of prey were created equal, and medieval falconers knew it. Each species came with its own temperament, skill set, and social baggage. Choosing the right bird wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a declaration of rank, wealth, and personality. At the top of the avian aristocracy sat the gyrfalcon, massive, regal, and notoriously difficult to acquire. Native to the Arctic, and rare even there, these birds were gifts fit for emperors. In fact, during the 12th century, the King of Norway sent gyrfalcons to the Holy Roman Emperor as diplomatic offerings. Owning one of these creatures was like having a medieval Ferrari. If the Ferrari could fly, murder rabbits, and occasionally bite your finger off. Next came the peregrine falcon, swift and elegant and favoured by knights. A peregrine in full stoop could reach speeds of over 200 mph. These were the sports cars of the sky, built for high-speed aerial assaults. Their reliability and effectiveness made them popular across classes, at least among those who could afford them. Saka falcons were also highly prized, especially in Eastern Europe and among crusaders who had seen their use in the Islamic world. Sakas were larger than peregrines but required more finesse to train, rewarding skilled falconers with dramatic mid-air hunts. Then there were hawks, particularly the goshawk and the sparrowhawk. Goshawks were favoured by landowners and barons. They flew through forests like missiles, snatching hares and pheasants with terrifying force. Sparrowhawks, on the other hand, were smaller, temperamental, and often relegated to clerics or women, not because they were less noble, but because of a long-standing belief that certain birds suited certain genders. As you can guess, this was based more on medieval vibes than science. Training any of these birds was not for the impatient. Falcons weren't born obedient. They had to be maned, a term referring to the slow, methodical process of getting a bird used to humans. You'd start by keeping the bird in darkness, gently feeding and handling it until it accepted your presence. Then came jesses, leg straps, hoods, perches, and endless repetition. But once that bond formed, once the bird flew from your glove, struck a rabbit mid-leap, and returned with blood on its beak, it was no longer just an animal. It was a living weapon, and it answered to you. Behind every successful bird was a sleep-deprived, often scratched-up human, the falconer. These men, and occasionally women, lived lives of intense discipline, patience, and often a little blood loss. Training a bird of prey wasn't just a skill, it was a lifestyle. Falconry required early mornings, constant vigilance, and an almost monastic devotion to the bird. This wasn't something you could casually pick up between sword practice and a tavern brawl. Once a falcon was in your care, it demanded your time, attention, and yes, even your affection. These birds needed to be fed, weighed daily, trained, cleaned, and sometimes even sung to. If that sounds a bit too tender, remember, a poorly bonded falcon could fly away the moment it was unhooded, and that's your year of training gone with a single flap of wings. Medieval falconers often lived on noble estates or within royal households. A skilled falconer was considered a valuable asset, sometimes even earning land or permanent positions within the court. Kings kept master falconers, professionals responsible not just for bird care, but for organising hunts, training assistants, and maintaining the prestige of the entire falconry operation. Because let's be clear, falconry was as much about showing off as it was about hunting. The falconer's toolkit was its own little armoury of medieval oddities. Leather gloves were essential, lest the bird's talons turn your wrist into ground beef. The hood, used to keep the bird calm when not flying, had to be custom-made for each bird's head. The jesses, thin leather straps tied to the bird's legs, helped control it during handling. Then there was the lure. A piece of meat or feathered bait, swung through the air to simulate prey, used to recall the bird mid-flight. Yes, falconry had its own props, and they had to be maintained with obsessive precision. And let's not forget the weighing. Daily weight checks were crucial. A bird that was too heavy wouldn't be motivated to hunt, too light, and it might be too weak to fly. Falconers had to keep their birds in a delicate zone of hunger, just enough to keep them deadly, but not desperate. In a world obsessed with hierarchy and control, falconry gave medieval nobles a unique thrill, commanding the wild, one dive-bombing feathered missile at a time. In the Middle Ages, everything had a social rank, even birds. Falconry was not merely about hunting, It was about displaying your place in the great cosmic pyramid of medieval life. Who you were determined what kind of bird you could fly, and heaven help you if you tried to punch above your station. Medieval society had an unspoken, and sometimes very much spoken, hierarchy of falconry. This wasn't just cultural, it was enshrined in sumptuary laws in places like England. These rules dictated which birds were appropriate for which social classes, ensuring that everyone stayed in their lane, even while out in the field chasing pheasants. The emperor might fly a gerfalcon, the most prized and majestic of all the hunting birds, white as snow, massive and fearsome. Kings were allotted the peregrine falcon or the gentle but noble merlin. Barons and knights might train psyker falcons or goshawks. Ladies of high birth were often given merlins, small swift birds suited for catching larks. Even clerics and monks got their own hawks, usually of the more manageable sparrowhawk variety. And peasants? Peasants weren't supposed to have falcons at all. If one was found in possession of a noble bird, it wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It could be treated as theft, or worse, poaching on aristocratic privilege. That falcon on your wrist could get you fined, imprisoned, or even mutilated, depending on the local lord's mood. But the falcon wasn't just a symbol of social class. It was a living accessory, like a luxury watch that screams, "I don't work for a living." Walking through the castle grounds with a bird perched calmly on your gloved hand told everyone you had the time, money, and education to maintain something as high maintenance as a hawk. It was aristocratic peacocking, literally. Even literature of the time reinforced this symbolism. Knights wooed ladies with falcon metaphors. Falcons stood for nobility, loyalty, and control over wildness. If you could tame a falcon, surely you could also tame your own passions, or more importantly, control a kingdom. In this way, falconry was never just about birds. It was about reinforcing the world order, with wings, claws, and an unspoken message. I'm important enough to train death on a leash. When medieval nobles took their falcons out to hunt, they weren't just gathering dinner, they were putting on a show. Falconry was equal parts sport, spectacle, and pageantry, with every detail designed to impress. This wasn't some solitary stroll through the woods. It was a full-blown social event, complete with trumpets, entourages, and embroidered gloves. Imagine the scene. A bright morning, banners fluttering, noblemen on horseback with velvet hoods covering their falcons. Ladies in elaborate gowns watch from under canopies as the hunt begins. Dogs bark, beaters flush out rabbits or partridges, and the falconer lifts the hood from his bird. In a blur of feathers and fury, the falcon takes flight, soaring high before plunging like a living arrow toward its prey. Everyone holds their breath. The impact is swift and brutal. A rabbit writhes under talons. A bird tumbles mid-air. The falcon returns, sometimes to the lure, sometimes to the falconer's glove, often to a small feast of warm meat. Applause may follow. Compliments are exchanged. Wine is poured. But make no mistake, this wasn't just entertainment. The hunt was a political statement. Hosting a falconry expedition showed off your wealth, your land, and your connections. Guests might include other nobles, foreign dignitaries, or the odd bishop with a taste for spectacle. To impress them, the birds had to be well trained, the hunt well orchestrated, and the kills clean. A clumsy falcon reflected poorly on its owner. Heaven forbid your bird missed. And of course, everything had to be documented. Tapestries were woven showing falcons mid-strike. Poems were written praising the falcon's dive and the nobleman's mastery. Even medieval bestiaries sometimes mythologized falcons as symbols of divine justice, striking from above, pure and swift. There was also strategy. Hunts weren't random. Falconers knew the terrain, the wind, and the timing. Some birds were trained to hunt in forests, others in open fields. There were coordinated attacks, hawks flushing birds into the sky for falcons to chase down. It was precision warfare, only feathery. At the end of the day, it didn't really matter how much meat was brought back. What mattered was who saw you, how your bird performed, and how gracefully you could command death from the air. Falconry was medieval Instagram, except the likes were real, and sometimes covered in feathers and blood. In a world where most sports were reserved for men swinging swords or jousting at full gallop, falconry was a curious exception. Noble women, queens, countesses, abbesses, were not only permitted to participate, but sometimes excelled in the art. In fact, a lady with a merlin on her wrist was practically a medieval fashion statement. Falconry offered a rare intersection of elegance, intelligence, and practicality that appealed to aristocratic women. It didn't require brute strength or battlefield scars. It demanded patience, observation, and a deep emotional connection with a wild animal, skills that were quietly respected even in a male-dominated society. The birds themselves were often chosen to match the falconer. Merlins, small and nimble falcons, were the traditional choice for noble women. They were fast, beautiful, and ideal for hunting smaller game like larks or quail. Don't let the dainty size fool you. Merlins packed a punch. A well-trained merlin could outfly and outmaneuver larger birds, making them a favourite among courtly ladies and even royal consorts. Perhaps the most famous falcon-loving lady was Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of both France and England. Known for her intelligence, political prowess, and general refusal to be sidelined, Eleanor reportedly kept and flew her own birds. Her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, was also said to be an avid falconer. These weren't idle hobbies. These were power moves. Even literature and art reflected this association. Courtly romances often portrayed falconry as a shared pastime between lovers, with the bird symbolising loyalty, devotion, or, more cheekily, tamed wildness. A lady gifting a man a falcon was practically medieval for, "I like you, but I'm also in control." In many cases, falconry gave women a chance to engage in public life, riding out on hunts, conversing with men of rank, and displaying their own expertise. A woman who could handle a falcon was not to be underestimated. She had skill, composure, and an animal trained to kill on command. You didn't mess with that. Of course, not all women had access. This was still a privilege of class. Peasant women might scare birds off the crops, but they weren't strapping hoods onto merlins. Still, within the upper crust, falconry gave women a rare space to shine, and even steal the spotlight. Behind the glamour of hunting parties and embroidered gloves lay a world of gritty, painstaking technique. Falconry wasn't just a noble pastime. It was a kind of medieval science, built on close observation, relentless trial and error, and a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of avian behaviour. Falconers were among the few in medieval society who truly studied animals. They didn't have formal degrees, but they had field-tested knowledge that bordered on the encyclopedic. They could read a bird's mood from the twitch of a tail feather, detect illness by the glint in its eye, and calculate the wind's direction just by licking a finger and watching the grass. Training a falcon began with manning, a slow and deliberate process that could take weeks or months. First, the bird was tethered in a darkened room to reduce visual stimulation. The falconer would sit nearby for hours on end, speaking softly, feeding the bird by hand, and gradually acclimating it to human presence. This wasn't a dominance game, it was about building trust. Push too hard, and the bird might become skittish or aggressive. Go too soft, and it would never obey. Once the bird accepted the falconer, it was introduced to equipment: the hood to keep it calm, the jesses for control, and the perch to simulate natural roosting. The falconer would carefully weigh the bird each day, because, unlike your average medieval knight, the falcon worked best when slightly hungry. Too full, and it wouldn't chase prey. Too lean, and it might collapse mid-flight. Then came flight training. The bird was encouraged to leap short distances for food, gradually increasing the range. Eventually, it would be flown on a crayons, a long, thin cord, allowing it to soar while remaining tethered. The final step was free flight, where the falconer held their breath and hoped the bird would return. Surprisingly, medieval falconers even understood rudimentary dietary science. They knew which meats kept the bird light but strong, usually fresh-killed dove or rabbit, and they recognized that spoiled meat could sicken or kill a raptor within hours. Some even kept detailed feeding logs, on parchment, of course. In a world that often fumbled with basic hygiene, falconers were quietly practicing an empirical, data-driven craft, one heartbeat, one feather, and one dive at a time. Spend 5 minutes around a medieval falconer, and you'd think you'd wandered into a secret guild of sky-worshipping codebreakers. Falconry didn't just have tools and technique, it had its own language, and it was gloriously complicated. This wasn't some casual jargon. Falconry terms were as structured and precise as a monk's Latin. If you misused a word, you outed yourself as a clueless amateur, and possibly risked embarrassing your noble host in front of the court. And that, in medieval society, was one step below committing treason. Let's start with the basics. A young falcon was an ayaz. A trained one was mewed. If a bird was molting, it was said to be enseamed. When it defecated, which it did, often and explosively, it was called muting. A hungry, ready-to-hunt falcon was sharp-set, and if it refused to return from flight, that's a yarrock bird gone at hack. Translation: you probably weren't getting it back. Then there was the equipment. The jess was the leather strap on the bird's legs. The bewit secured bells, yes, bells, to its ankles so you could track it through the sky. The creance was the long training line. The lure was swung through the air to recall the bird, and a well-made one was practically a work of art. Feathers, leather, meat, and sometimes ribbon, all stitched into a deadly little puppet. And we haven't even touched on social greetings. There was an entire vocabulary just for referring to who could fly what. For example, if someone told you, "A yeoman should fly a goshawk," that wasn't idle advice. That was a social boundary dressed up as a bird recommendation. This dense lexicon wasn't just about being precise. It was a status flex. The more fluent you were in falcon speak, the more you proved your breeding, education, and worth. It was the Latin of the elite outdoorsman, a secret handshake in spoken form. Even today, many of these phrases have slipped into modern English without most people noticing. Fed up, for example. That came from falcons too full to fly. Hoodwinked? That's what happened when you slipped a hood over a bird's eyes. Like all things medieval and noble, falconry eventually began to fade, not with a dramatic crash, but with a slow, dignified descent. The rise of gunpowder weapons and firearms in the late Middle Ages changed hunting forever. You no longer needed a year to train a falcon to catch a hare when a musket could drop it in seconds. The falcon, once the apex predator of the noble hunt, was suddenly inefficient. Falconry didn't disappear overnight. It lingered, clinging to courts and ceremonial traditions. Some kings and queens continued to keep birds purely for show. Others tried to preserve it as a high art, the way you might keep an antique lute or a suit of armour. But the truth was simple. Time and technology moved on, and falcons could not compete with lead bullets and double-barreled convenience. The social shift didn't help either. As the medieval order gave way to the early modern world, the rigid class structures that upheld falconry began to erode. The once sacred rules of who could fly, what bird grew blurry. With urbanization and industrialization creeping across Europe, there just weren't as many deer-filled forests and hawk-friendly moors to strut through. Yet falconry refused to die. Instead, it transformed. In the East, particularly in the Middle East and parts of Central Asia, it remained deeply rooted in tradition, surviving as a cultural and even spiritual practice. In the West, falconry was reborn in the 19th and 20th centuries as a sport of conservationists and enthusiasts. What was once a medieval show of dominance became a gesture of respect for nature and heritage. Today, falconry is practiced around the world, and in 2010, UNESCO even recognized it as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. It may no longer determine your social rank or impress a duchess, but it still demands the same patience, knowledge, and reverence that medieval falconers mastered centuries ago. The falcon on the glove no longer signals political power, but it still stares down the wind with primal elegance, and the bond between falconer and bird, forged through hours of silent trust, still echoes a truth the Middle Ages knew well, that nature, when respected, can be both companion and conqueror. In the year 1137, under the crescent moons of the Abbasid Caliphate, a boy named Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born in the fortress town of Tikrit, nestled along the Tigris River. His birth went unnoticed by history's great chroniclers. There were no prophecies, no omens in the stars, just another child born into a Kurdish military family, under the roof of a father who served as a local governor. And yet, this boy would grow to become Saladin, the most revered Muslim general of the Middle Ages. A man whose name would strike both awe and admiration, not just in the Islamic world, but in the courts of his Christian enemies. From the beginning, Saladin's world was one of instability and ambition. The Islamic world was divided. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had long since lost its grip on real power. The Fatimids in Egypt clung to their waning Shia rule, and the Levant was a checkerboard of emirates and city-states barely holding their own. All the while, Christian crusader kingdoms, propped up by European knights and papal funding, grew bolder by the day, slicing into Muslim lands with alarming confidence. Saladin's early years were shaped not by scholarly training or divine visions, but by military pragmatism. His uncle, Shirkuh, a seasoned general in the service of the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din, took young Saladin under his wing. It wasn't love or favoritism. It was necessity. The region was on fire, and everyone with a sword was needed. And so Yusuf learned, not just the sword, but politics, religion, and warcraft. He was quiet, observant, almost scholarly in nature. Few would have predicted this soft-spoken youth would command armies. But Saladin had something rarer than charisma: strategic patience. He watched, waited, absorbed, and when the time came, he moved with precision. It was an era that forged giants, and though Saladin did not yet carry the title Sultan, nor had he raised a banner of his own, the pieces were falling into place. His journey from forgotten noble-born to commander of the faithful had already begun. He had been born in the shadows of collapsing empires, but he would rise to unify them under one crescent, one sword, and one enduring legacy. By the mid-12th century, Egypt was a fractured land ruled by the fading Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty barely holding off chaos. Power vacuums make for easy conquest, and both Christian crusaders and Muslim warlords had their eyes on Cairo. Into this storm rode Shirkuh, Saladin's uncle, on the orders of Nur ad-Din, the Sunni ruler of Aleppo and Damascus. Saladin came as Shirkuh's assistant, a loyal nephew, not yet a leader. But Egypt would prove to be his crucible. The Fatimid court was a snake pit of intrigue, bribery, and betrayal. Viziers schemed, crusader envoys lurked, and the caliph himself was more figurehead than ruler. Shirkuh played the game ruthlessly, battling both external armies and internal plots. Saladin, ever the quiet observer, watched his uncle cut through Cairo's political webs with a sword in one hand and gold in the other. In 1169, Shirkuh died suddenly, some say from overindulgence, others from poison. And just like that, the most powerful army in Egypt had no commander. The Fatimid Caliph, perhaps out of desperation or political convenience, named Saladin the new vizier. It should have been a death sentence. Saladin was young, foreign, and Sunni in a Shia court, where enemies outnumbered allies. But this was where the world got its first glimpse of Saladin the statesman. Instead of purging his rivals with fire and sword, he moved with careful grace. He kept the Fatimid Caliph as a figurehead, retained popular officials, and slowly, methodically, built loyalty among Egypt's fractured elites. But he was also transforming Egypt from the inside out. He funded Sunni madrasas, replaced key military officers, and realigned Egypt with Nur ad-Din's Sunni cause. And when the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid died in 1171, Saladin didn't declare himself sultan. He simply had the Friday prayers recited in the name of the Abbasid Caliph, signalling to the Islamic world Egypt had returned to Sunni orthodoxy. It was bold. It was bloodless. It was genius. By the time Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin wasn't just vizier. He was the de facto ruler of Egypt, with its wealth, its army, and its strategic position in the Muslim world. The general had found his battlefield. The diplomat had found his throne. With Egypt firmly in his grasp, Saladin now turned his gaze eastward, to Syria, to Damascus, and to the legacy of his former overlord, Nur ad-Din. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, his territories fractured. His heir was a child, and ambitious emirs circled like vultures. Syria, the cradle of Saladin's early career, was suddenly vulnerable and ripe for reunification. But Saladin wasn't yet a sultan. He had Egypt, yes, but his claim to Syria wasn't automatic. There were rivals, holdouts, and former allies who now saw him as a usurper. He had to tread carefully, diplomatic enough not to appear power-hungry, but forceful enough to seize opportunity when it appeared. In typical Saladin fashion, he moved with calculated restraint. First, he marched into Damascus, not with a conquering army, but as a protector of Nur ad-Din's son. The people welcomed him. He paid debts, lowered taxes, and emphasized continuity over conquest. His takeover felt more like a homecoming than an invasion. Other cities were not so agreeable. Aleppo resisted, and so did various splinter rulers loyal to the idea of a divided Syria. Saladin fought battles, negotiated truces, and offered mercy where most men would have delivered vengeance. It wasn't just about blood, it was about legitimacy. He needed the people to want him to rule. Between 1174 and 1183, Saladin played a brilliant game of military chess. He secured Homs, Hama, and even confronted the powerful assassins, yes, the real ones, the Hashashin, who tried to murder him twice. He survived both attempts and eventually made peace with their enigmatic leader at Alamut. Even his enemies recognized that Saladin had become too formidable to destroy and too righteous to dismiss. By the time he claimed Aleppo in 1183, Saladin was no longer just a military leader. He was the unifier of Muslim lands from the Nile to the Euphrates. His authority was not inherited, but earned, through diplomacy, endurance, and above all, a patient commitment to restoring Islamic unity against the looming threat of the Crusader states. He now had the lands, the men, and the religious mandate. The jihad against the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer a theory. It was a plan, and the man leading it wore no crown, but the entire Muslim world knew his name. By the early 1180s, Saladin was no longer just a regional power. He was becoming a symbol. To Muslims across the fractured Middle East, he was a unifier. To his enemies in the Crusader states, he was becoming something more dangerous than a brute with an army. He was a strategist with a mission. His authority now stretched across Egypt, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. He held the political capital, the religious legitimacy, and the military might to launch a war that many believed had been coming since the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. But Saladin didn't strike immediately. He wasn't reckless. He waited, building alliances, securing supply lines, and ensuring that when the time came, his campaign would be more than just a series of raids. It would be a holy war with clear objectives, not chaos disguised as jihad. His restraint, however, was not shared by everyone. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, under the hot-headed rule of Reynold of Chatillon, continually provoked Saladin's forces. Reynold attacked Muslim caravans, broke truces, and even threatened a march on Mecca itself, a red line few Muslim leaders could ignore. Saladin responded not with rage, but with intent. In 1187, he assembled the largest army he had ever commanded. He rallied troops from across the Islamic world: Turks, Kurds, Arabs, Berbers, even volunteers from as far as Persia. This was not just a war, it was a religious cause, and Saladin made sure his men knew it. He was also careful to frame the conflict in moral terms. His war was not against all Christians, only those who desecrated truces, violated treaties, and disrespected Islam's sacred places. Even in his declarations of jihad, he maintained a tone of dignity. This wasn't vengeance, it was justice. By now, both sides knew what was coming. Skirmishes increased. Crusader outposts fell one by one, and on the horizon loomed the city that had become the heart of the Christian presence in the Holy Land, Jerusalem. But first, Saladin would meet his enemies in open battle. He wasn't a reckless warlord. He was a lion with a long memory, and the patience of a chess master who had finally lined up his pieces. The time for waiting was over. It was the summer of 1187. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had grown arrogant, fractured, and poorly led. Their king, Guy of Lusignan, was indecisive, and Reynald of Châtillon, the provocateur of countless broken truces, was still stirring conflict with raids on Muslim caravans. When Reynald attacked a rich trading convoy bound for Damascus, violating a fragile truce, Saladin had had enough. He sent a message to Reynald. "I swear by the name of God, I will kill you with my own hands." And he meant it. What followed was not a raid, it was a full-scale campaign. Saladin mobilized an army of more than 30,000 men, and in July 1187 lured the Crusader forces away from the safety of their fortresses. The bait was the city of Tiberias, strategically located near the Sea of Galilee and home to Count Raymond's wife. The Crusaders marched to relieve it, despite lacking water and under the punishing Levantine sun. It was exactly what Saladin wanted. He had chosen the battlefield carefully. The Horns of Hattin, 2 rocky hills with dry grasslands and no access to fresh water. His forces surrounded the Crusaders, cut off their supply lines, and set fire to the fields. Trapped in the heat, choking on smoke, and dehydrated beyond endurance, the Christian army began to fall apart. Saladin's men struck hard and without mercy. Archers rained down arrows. Cavalry charges broke the Crusader lines. By the end of the day, the once proud army of Jerusalem was annihilated. Thousands were taken prisoner, including King Guy himself. And Reynald? Saladin honoured his vow. He personally executed him, but spared the king, out of courtesy, not weakness. He treated many captured knights with dignity, even freeing some for ransom. It was brutality balanced with statesmanship, the Saladin signature. The true cross, the sacred relic of the Crusader armies, was captured and paraded through Damascus like a trophy of divine justice. The Muslim world rejoiced. The Christians of Europe reeled in shock. It was a defeat not just of arms, but of morale and myth. The Battle of Hattin didn't just break the Crusader army, it opened the gates of Jerusalem. After the crushing victory at Hattin, Saladin moved swiftly. Castle after castle fell to his advancing forces. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Beirut, Ascalon, all surrendered or were taken by storm. The once mighty Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was crumbling. Only one great city remained, Jerusalem. For Muslims, Jerusalem was not just another strategic prize. It was the third holiest city in Islam. Lost nearly a century earlier during the First Crusade, its fall in 1099 had been marked by massacres so brutal that blood was said to run knee-deep in the streets. Saladin's objective was clear. He would retake the city, but he would not repeat the horrors of its past conquest. In September 1187, Saladin's forces surrounded Jerusalem. Inside, the defenders were led by Balian of Ibelin, one of the last competent Frankish lords. Knowing he stood no chance militarily, Balian negotiated. He begged Saladin to show mercy to the city's inhabitants, and Saladin agreed, but with conditions. Instead of a bloodbath, he offered safe passage in exchange for ransom. Christians would pay to leave, and those who could not would be freed through donations by Saladin and his commanders. Many were ransomed, others were released outright. There was no pillaging, no desecration of churches. Even the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was respected and protected. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem was returned to Muslim rule, exactly 88 years after the Crusaders had seized it. Saladin entered the city not as a butcher, but as a liberator. He went first to Al-Aqsa Mosque, purified it, and ordered the restoration of Islamic holy sites. The golden dome of the rock shone once again as a symbol of Muslim sovereignty, not only political, but spiritual. News of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves through Europe. The Pope reportedly died of a heart attack upon hearing the news. Crusader kingdoms were in panic. Yet even in their writings, many Christian chroniclers praised Saladin's mercy, comparing it favourably to their own ancestors' actions a century prior. In a single campaign, Saladin had achieved what no Muslim leader had done since the Crusades began. He recaptured Jerusalem with brilliance and restraint, and he elevated his name not only in Islamic history, but in the hearts of even his enemies. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 shattered the Christian world like a thunderclap. In Europe, kings were not just outraged, they were humiliated. This wasn't the loss of a distant outpost. This was the Holy City, the very heart of Christian pilgrimage, now in the hands of a Muslim ruler. Pope Gregory VIII wasted no time. He issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling for a new crusade. And this time, it wouldn't be led by minor lords or pious volunteers. Kings were coming. The response was massive. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all took up the cross. It would become known as the Third Crusade, a campaign of vengeance, prestige, and redemption. And at its centre was Saladin, the man who had to face the full might of European Christendom. Saladin prepared for war. He reinforced coastal fortresses, secured key trade routes, and stocked his armies with fresh supplies. He knew what was coming, and he knew these were no ordinary knights. These were rulers with vast treasuries, elite soldiers, and seasoned generals. In 1190, Barbarossa drowned en route in Anatolia, his army dissolving without their leader. But Richard and Philip pressed on, landing in the Levant and capturing Acre in 1191 after a brutal siege. Saladin had tried to relieve the city, but was forced to withdraw when disease and attrition wore down his army. The recapture of Acre was a blow, but Saladin didn't crumble. He continued to harass Crusader forces with hit-and-run tactics, avoiding open battle while bleeding them dry. Still, the Crusaders pushed forward. At the Battle of Arsuf, Richard scored a tactical victory, and Saladin witnessed firsthand the English king's formidable prowess. Yet despite the back and forth, neither side could truly land a final blow. Jerusalem remained under Saladin's control, but Richard lacked the numbers and political will to storm it. The two titans eventually came to terms. In 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims would be granted safe access to the holy sites. It wasn't a total victory for either side, but it was peace, forged between two warriors who had come to respect one another deeply. Saladin had held his ground, not just with the sword, but with diplomacy and dignity. By the end of the Third Crusade, Saladin was not just a military commander. He had become a legend, admired by friend and foe alike. Even in an age marked by religious fanaticism and brutal war, Saladin stood out for his extraordinary sense of honour, restraint, and chivalry. Western chroniclers, often loath to praise their enemies, couldn't help but admire him. Stories spread of Saladin sending doctors and cold water to Richard the Lionheart during his illness. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin is said to have sent him 2 new ones, saying a king should never fight on foot. Whether embellished or not, these tales fed into a powerful myth that Saladin was a warrior who fought hard but fairly, and one who respected his enemies, even as he defeated them. But Saladin's generosity didn't stop at kings. After battles, he frequently spared prisoners who could not pay ransom. He protected Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, allowing priests and pilgrims to continue their worship even under Muslim rule. While many leaders throughout history demanded loyalty through fear, Saladin inspired it through character. This wasn't weakness, it was calculated strength. His mercy gave him political capital, helping win over cities and tribes without having to spill blood. And for many Muslims, his conduct wasn't just politically wise, it was Islamic virtue in action. He embodied the principles of justice, humility and mercy as defined in the Quran, presenting an image of jihad not as blind destruction, but as noble struggle in the service of faith and order. At the same time, Saladin lived modestly. Despite ruling over vast lands and immense wealth, he was known for sleeping on mats, eating simple food and wearing plain clothes. When he died, he left behind no personal fortune, no castles filled with gold, no overflowing treasuries. His possessions could barely cover the cost of his own burial. This humility, paired with military brilliance, transformed him into a symbol. To Muslims, he was the ideal mujahid. To Christians, the worthy adversary. To history, a rare figure who managed to combine power and principle, politics and piety, war and wisdom. Saladin wasn't just a conqueror. He was a man who elevated how conquest itself was remembered. By 1193, the dust of war had settled. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, and peace, however fragile, held across the Holy Land. The Crusaders had failed to reclaim their sacred city, but they had secured access to it. Saladin, weary but dignified, returned to Damascus. His warhorse aged, his body thin, and his soul stretched by years of battle, diplomacy, and the burdens of leadership. But even legends must fall silent. In March of that year, Saladin fell ill with a fever. He was 55. No violent end met him. No final charge, no assassin's blade. Just a slow, quiet unravelling in a small Damascus chamber. The man who had once commanded empires now lay in a simple room, surrounded not by jewels or slaves, but by family, scribes, and physicians. When he died, it was discovered that he had almost nothing to his name. Despite ruling over the wealthiest territories in the Islamic world, Saladin had given away nearly everything to charity, his soldiers, the poor, and scholars. His funeral had to be paid for by borrowing money. In an age of greed and ostentation, this was almost inconceivable. His body was buried near the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, where his modest tomb still stands today. Humble, quiet, unguarded. Visitors have included kings, presidents, and even Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was so moved by the legacy of Saladin that he offered to fund a new tomb in marble. The locals declined. The simplicity was the point. Saladin's death left a vacuum. His sons lacked his vision, and his empire fragmented quickly. But his reputation endured, not through dynastic continuity, but through narrative. He was remembered in Europe not with hatred, but with reverence. Dante placed him in the first circle of hell, not with murderers or tyrants, but among virtuous pagans. In the West, he was seen as a paradox, the Muslim warrior who fought Christians, but lived more like a Christian ideal than many Knights of the Cross. In the Muslim world, Saladin became a template of righteous leadership, one still evoked today by politicians, preachers, and poets. His life wasn't just a rise to power. It was a blueprint for how to wield power with purpose. Saladin's sword was sheathed in 1193, but his name never was. In medieval Europe, the church set the rhythm of life, from birth and marriage to death and even fun. One of the strictest times in this cycle was Lent, a 40-day season of fasting and penance leading up to Easter. For medieval Christians, Lent meant giving up rich foods like meat, dairy and eggs, and embracing austerity, prayer, and self-denial. But before this grim season of sacrifice began, something extraordinary happened. A wild, noisy, and often downright absurd festival called Carnival. Carnival was the last hurrah, a final blast of indulgence before weeks of sacrifice. It was a sanctioned chaos, where normal rules were flipped upside down. People ate, drank, and danced with reckless abandon, stuffing themselves with foods that Lent would forbid. Meats, cheese, butter, and eggs were consumed in obscene quantities. No ingredient was safe from the feast. But it wasn't just about food. Carnival was a time when social order was temporarily suspended. Peasants mocked their lords, fools paraded as kings, and masked revelers paraded through the streets in costumes that blurred the lines between human and animal, saint and sinner. The usual hierarchy melted away in a haze of wine, music, and laughter. This festival was about more than fun. It was a ritual cleansing of society's sins, a symbolic reversal designed to remind everyone that the world was imperfect and the established order fragile. By allowing a brief period of role reversal and license, medieval communities believed they could expel evil and corruption before re-entering the sober, pious season of Lent. Carnival was also deeply theatrical. Processions featured grotesque masks, caricatures of clergy and nobility, and performances that mocked religious and political authorities. People engaged in pranks, street theatre, and even ritualized fighting, sometimes spilling real blood. The church tolerated, even encouraged this madness, seeing it as a necessary purge before the spiritual renewal Lent promised. So before the fasting, before the penitence, before the cold, grey days of Lent, medieval towns and villages exploded in colour, noise, and chaos. It was a momentary rebellion against restraint, a celebration of human folly and sin, a final taste of earthly pleasures before the soul's harsh diet began. Carnival's roots reach far deeper than the medieval church's calendar. Its origins lie tangled in centuries-old traditions, pagan festivals, and the human urge to celebrate before winter's end. Long before Christianity spread across Europe, ancient peoples marked the changing seasons with wild rites, feasts to honor fertility, to chase away evil spirits, and to welcome the rebirth of the sun. When Christianity arrived, it didn't erase these festivals, but instead absorbed and transformed them. The church cleverly timed Carnival to occur just before Lent, turning a pagan feast of excess into a Christian ritual. The name itself, Carnival, likely comes from the Latin carnvale, meaning farewell to meat. It was a clear signal that the good times were ending, and a strict, meatless season was about to begin. Throughout medieval Europe, Carnival took on local flavours and customs. In Italy, Venice's famous masked balls created an atmosphere of mystery and disguise that became legendary. In Germany and Switzerland, elaborate parades and colourful costumes celebrated the departure of winter spirits. In France, masked dances and wild men costumes mocked authority and social norms. Despite regional differences, one theme remained constant: the suspension of social order. The peasant could impersonate a noble, fools ruled the streets, the poor mocked the rich without fear of punishment. The church's sanction of this role reversal might seem surprising, but it served a social purpose. It acted as a pressure valve for society, releasing tensions that might otherwise explode in rebellion or unrest. Carnival also had a darker side. In many places, the festivities included bawdy humour, crude jokes, and even sanctioned violence. Masks hid identities, allowing people to say and do things that would be forbidden the rest of the year. Sexual innuendo, drinking to excess, and public disorder were not only tolerated, but expected. By the Middle Ages, Carnival was firmly established as a pre-Lenten ritual with deep popular appeal. It was a time when people from all walks of life came together, rich and poor, noble and peasant, to eat, drink, and act out fantasies before the long, penitential season of Lent began. One of the most striking features of medieval Carnival was the mystery and madness of masks and costumes. For weeks, people prepared elaborate disguises, transforming themselves into animals, devils, saints, and figures from folk tales. These masks were not mere decoration, they were tools of transformation. allowing wearers to shed their everyday identities and step into a world of chaos and freedom. Masks gave the wearer anonymity, a kind of magical invisibility that broke down social barriers. A peasant could become a lord, a wife could mock her husband, and even the clergy could be parodied without fear of retribution. This reversal of roles was at the heart of Carnival's power. The usual hierarchy, the rigid chain of feudal society, was temporarily broken. Costumes ranged from the grotesque to the whimsical. People donned robes stitched with bells, wore oversized animal heads, or painted their faces with bright, unnatural colours. In some towns, wild men paraded the streets, men dressed in leaves, animal skins and feathers, embodying the untamed forces of nature. These figures were a living reminder of the wildness lurking beneath civilization's surface. Carnival was a performance as much as a party. Processions wound through town squares with dancers, musicians, and actors playing out scenes of reversal and mockery. Sometimes the festivities included feasts of fools, where minor clerics or peasants were crowned king for a day and given license to ridicule their superiors openly. This theatricality was not just for entertainment, it was deeply symbolic. The masks and role reversals allowed medieval people to confront their fears, frustrations, and desires in a socially acceptable way. By mocking authority and embracing folly, they reminded themselves of the fragile nature of power and order. Yet the Church had a complicated relationship with these celebrations. While it officially endorsed Carnival as a prelude to Lent, it was also wary of the excesses. Some clergy condemned the obscenities and chaos, warning that such license might lead souls astray. But the truth was clear. Carnival was a necessary release, a cultural pressure valve that kept society from exploding under its own weight. In the wild masks and raucous laughter, medieval Europe found a momentary escape, a space where the world's rules could be bent, if only until Ash Wednesday dawned. Carnival was most famously a time to indulge in food and drink with abandon, a final, lavish feast before the austere discipline of Lent. For 40 days, Christians were expected to give up rich foods like meat, dairy, eggs, and butter. But during Carnival, these forbidden delights were piled high on tables, and the people ate until they could eat no more. This wasn't just about gluttony, it was ritual. Medieval cooks and bakers crafted special dishes to celebrate the occasion. Pies stuffed with meat and eggs, rich cakes and spiced wines flowed freely. In some regions, communities organised grand banquets in town squares, inviting the poor and rich alike to share in the abundance. One of the most iconic carnival treats was the king cake, a sweet pastry containing a hidden figurine or bean. Whoever found it was crowned the temporary king or queen of the festivities, a playful nod to the role reversals that defined the season. This tradition survives in many places today, from New Orleans to parts of Europe. Alcohol played a starring role. Medieval wines, ales and meads were often infused with herbs and spices to disguise rough flavours and add punch. Revellers drank deeply, dancing and singing through the nights. Taverns and alehouses overflowed, and local authorities struggled, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to contain the resulting disorder. The food and drink weren't just for pleasure. They were a way of preparing the body and spirit for Lent. By indulging in the forbidden before fasting, medieval Christians believed they could cleanse themselves of sin and weakness. The over-the-top eating and drinking symbolized casting off earthly cares to focus on spiritual renewal. However, the excesses often spiraled out of control. Chroniclers of the time wrote with a mix of amusement and horror about drunken brawls, public indecency, and outright riots. Nobles sometimes joined the chaos, disguising themselves to mingle with commoners, blurring social lines even further. Despite the wildness, Carnival's feasting was a communal act, a shared experience that bonded communities together. It was a reminder that even in a world dominated by faith and discipline, human desire for pleasure and connection was powerful and undeniable. As plates emptied and mugs drained, the revellers knew the party would soon end, and the serious business of fasting and penitence would begin. It might seem strange that the medieval church both condemned and celebrated carnival with equal passion. On one hand, the festival was a wild and raucous affair, filled with drinking, lewd jokes, and open mockery of authority, including the clergy themselves. On the other, carnival was an essential part of the Christian calendar, marking the final opportunity for worldly indulgence before the solemn season of Lent. The church's attitude was complex and pragmatic. It understood that carnival served a vital social function. By allowing a controlled release of tension and sin, it helped prevent more dangerous unrest or rebellion throughout the year. The festival acted as a kind of safety valve, where people could let off steam under the watchful eyes of the church. Clergy often took part in carnival, albeit with some reservations. In many towns, minor clerics were made kings of fools, crowned and given license to behave absurdly for a day. These role reversals symbolized humility before God, acknowledging that no one, not even the church hierarchy, was immune to folly and sin. Yet there were limits. Church authorities tried to regulate carnival, issuing edicts against excessive violence, blasphemy, and sexual immorality. They feared that the festivities might corrupt souls rather than prepare them for Lent. Some bishops condemned masked dances and bawdy plays as temptations to evil. Despite these warnings, the popular spirit was hard to contain. The church often found itself walking a fine line between control and indulgence, sometimes sanctioning the festivities, other times condemning them, but rarely able to fully suppress them. Theologically, carnival was framed as a time of penance by proxy. The sins committed in the festival were meant to be temporary and forgiven, purged by the Lenten fast. It was an acknowledgement that humans were flawed and prone to excess, but that God's mercy and repentance could restore balance. In essence, carnival embodied the paradox of medieval Christianity, a religion demanding strict discipline, yet rooted in forgiveness and humanity's imperfection. The Church's uneasy embrace of carnival revealed a recognition that spiritual renewal sometimes requires a little chaos first. Among the most infamous carnival traditions in medieval Europe was the Feast of Fools, a day when the usual social order was turned completely upside down and the world seemed turned inside out. This feast wasn't just about food and drink, it was a full-blown festival of mockery, satire, and role reversal. During the Feast of Fools, the lowliest members of the church, clerks, choir boys, and minor officials, were elevated to mock positions of power. They might be crowned bishop or pope for the day, presiding over parodies of religious ceremonies. These fools would deliver ridiculous sermons, sing bawdy songs, and act out absurd plays that poked fun at the very institutions they served. The message was clear: no one was beyond satire, and humility was a virtue, even for the powerful. But this wasn't just clerical mischief. The Feast of Fools was a way for the entire community to engage in social satire. Peasants dressed as nobles, townsfolk mocked their rulers, and elaborate costumes lampooned everything from the clergy to the monarchy. In a time when speaking truth to power could be deadly, carnival offered a brief window when criticism was not only tolerated, but encouraged. This celebration of inversion had deep psychological and social functions. It allowed people to express frustration with their daily hardships and rigid social hierarchies. For a day, the disenfranchised could laugh at the powerful, and the powerful could see themselves reflected in humorous exaggeration. It was a release valve that maintained social cohesion by acknowledging inequality without allowing it to explode into rebellion. However, the Feast of Fools was controversial. Church authorities often viewed it with suspicion or outright hostility, condemning the irreverence and disorder it encouraged. In some places the festival was banned or curtailed, especially as the Renaissance and Reformation brought new religious sensibilities. Yet its spirit lived on in other carnival customs and later European festivals. The Feast of Fools reminds us that medieval society was not as rigid or humorless as often portrayed. Even in the darkest times, people found ways to laugh at themselves and their rulers, a tradition that survives in modern satire and political comedy. Carnival was as much a sensory explosion as it was a social upheaval. The streets, town squares, and marketplaces of medieval Europe came alive with music, dance, and spectacle, turning ordinary places into stages for wild celebration. Musicians played a crucial role in Carnival's atmosphere. Drummers, fiddlers, flutists, and pipers performed everywhere, from churchyards to taverns, inviting everyone to join the revelry. Their tunes ranged from raucous jigs and reels to bawdy ballads that teased and titillated listeners. The music was infectious, driving crowds to dance in large circles or impromptu pairs. Dance itself was a form of communal release and rebellion. Medieval carnival dances could be exuberant or downright chaotic. Some were highly choreographed, with participants donning elaborate costumes, moving in patterns that mimicked the turning of the seasons or the inversion of social order. Others were free-for-alls, with people stomping, spinning, and laughing in a frenzy of joy and abandon. Parades were another centerpiece of carnival. Floats decorated with grotesque figures, mythical beasts, and caricatures of local dignitaries rolled through the streets. These floats were often pulled by oxen or horses, and accompanied by jesters and acrobats who performed tricks and told jokes. The spectacle was as much political commentary as entertainment, highlighting the absurdities of authority and celebrating the community's shared identity. In towns like Venice, Carnival's music and dance reached legendary heights. Masked balls and public performances blurred the lines between classes, genders, and even realities. Participants could reinvent themselves entirely. Nobles danced with servants, men disguised as women flirted with strangers, and the city's canals echoed with laughter and song late into the night. But Carnival's music and dance also had a deeper, almost spiritual meaning. They symbolized renewal and transformation, the shedding of old grievances, and the promise of new beginnings, as the harsh winter gave way to spring and Lent to Easter. Despite occasional complaints from moralists about the licentiousness of the celebrations, music and dance remained central to Carnival's enduring appeal. They were the heartbeat of a festival that celebrated life's contradictions, order and chaos, piety and pleasure, restraint and release. While Carnival was a time of laughter, music, and revelry, it was also a season when violence and chaos often erupted in the streets. The anonymity provided by masks and costumes gave people the freedom to act out their darkest impulses, without fear of retribution. What started as playful mischief sometimes spiraled into brutal confrontations. Medieval chroniclers often described scenes of drunken brawls, riots, and public disorder during Carnival. Crowds packed into narrow streets, fueled by wine and boundless energy, could easily turn on one another, or on the unfortunate targets of their frustrations. Street fights over stolen food, insults, or damaged costumes were common. Sometimes these clashes escalated into larger conflicts, involving whole neighborhoods or rival guilds. The role reversals that defined Carnival could also provoke dangerous challenges to authority. Mock kings and queens might command acts of defiance against nobles or clergy. Peasants dressing as lords flaunted power they rarely held. Although these acts were generally tolerated during the festival, they occasionally sparked genuine resentment and reprisals once the masks came off. Authorities struggled to maintain control during Carnival. Town guards and watchmen were often overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of revelers. Some cities instituted strict regulations, limiting the hours of festivities or forbidding certain costumes and weapons. However, enforcement was spotty at best, and officials often turned a blind eye, recognizing that suppressing Carnival outright might incite worse unrest. Carnival's mixture of joy and danger made it a unique social pressure valve. It allowed people to release pent-up frustrations in a controlled environment, preventing these grievances from boiling over into full-scale rebellion. Yet the line between controlled chaos and outright disorder was always thin. The masks and disguises that gave Carnival its mystique also made it impossible to hold individuals accountable for their actions. This anonymity both protected and emboldened revelers, creating a space where the usual rules did not apply. In this way, Carnival reflected the contradictions of medieval society itself. a world of strict hierarchies and rigid norms, yet one that recognized the need for occasional upheaval and release. The chaos behind the masks was not just indulgence. It was a vital part of how communities survived and reset themselves year after year. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and modern era, the wild spirit of carnival began to change. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation brought stricter religious controls, and authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, started cracking down on the excesses of the festival. What was once a chaotic release before Lent became more regulated, more sanitized, and sometimes even banned outright. Yet Carnival refused to disappear. Instead, it evolved, adapting to new cultural and religious realities. In places like Venice, the tradition of masked balls and elaborate processions continued, becoming symbols of aristocratic prestige rather than communal revolt. In rural areas, folk customs persisted, preserving the role reversals, feasts, and jesting in simpler local forms. Even today, echoes of medieval carnival survive around the world. The colourful parades of Mardi Gras in New Orleans, the masked festivities of Venice, and the raucous street parties of Brazil's carnival all trace their roots back to this medieval tradition. The idea of a pre-Lenten celebration, an explosion of colour, noise and freedom before the solemn fast, remains alive and well. Carnival's legacy also lives on in the arts and literature. From the satirical plays of the Renaissance to modern political cartoons, the spirit of mocking authority and embracing folly continues to inspire. The masks, the music, and the idea that society's rules can be bent or broken for a time remind us of our shared humanity and the need for release. Importantly, Carnival teaches us about the balance between order and chaos, how societies manage tension, express dissatisfaction, and renew themselves through ritualized rebellion. In the Middle Ages, Carnival was more than a party. It was a social safety valve, a celebration of life's contradictions, and a momentary glimpse into a world turned upside down. So next time you see a masked ball, a wild parade, or hear the call of "Let the good times roll," remember that you're witnessing a tradition shaped by centuries of human need for both restraint and release. A legacy born from the masked revelers who dared to mock kings, dance with fools, and drink themselves senseless before the fasting began.